What was the most racist rule your school had? The most openly discriminatory rule at my high school was also the one our principal defended most proudly. No language other than English could be spoken anywhere on school property. Principal Richard Caldwell repeated it during morning announcements so often that every student could recite the consequences from memory. One word in Spanish, Vietnamese, French, Haitian Creole, or any other language meant an immediate 3-day suspension and a notation on your permanent disciplinary record. He always framed the policy as a matter of safety and success. According to him, English was the language that prepared students for the future, while every other language created confusion, secrecy, and division. The rule became even harsher after he claimed he had overheard a group of students plotting something in Spanish. He never explained what they had supposedly been plotting, and no one ever produced evidence that a threat had existed. That did not matter. From then on, teachers were expected to listen in the hallways, cafeterias, bathrooms, parking lot, and even near the student pickup area for anything that was not English. Spanish was the only language my family spoke naturally at home. I could speak English well, and I earned strong grades, but spending an entire school day monitoring every word before it left my mouth was exhausting. It felt as though half of my brain had to remain on guard, while the other half tried to learn chemistry, history, and algebra. My mother gradually stopped attending school events after a teacher corrected her accent in front of other parents, and then spoke to her as if she were a child. Other families reacted the same way. Students hung up on their parents in the middle of urgent calls, rather than risk answering in their native language. Puerto Rican students, Vietnamese students, Haitian students, and kids from several immigrant families moved through the building as if we had all been instructed to leave part of ourselves at home. A friend of mine was suspended for calling out to his grandmother in Spanish when she arrived to pick him up. Another student lost a scholarship after he stubbed his toe, cursed in French without thinking, and was reported by a teacher standing nearby. Those punishments taught the rest of us exactly what the school wanted. Silence first, common sense second. The rule was especially dangerous for me because my grandmother lived with us and spoke almost no English. Her heart condition had been getting worse, and my mother worked at a warehouse 40 minutes away where she could not always answer her phone. That made me the most reliable emergency contact during the school day. By my senior year, I had gone almost 2 full years without a suspension because I had become skilled at swallowing Spanish words before they escaped. Even when other students tried to trick me into responding as a joke, I kept my expression blank and answered only in English. I also created workarounds that technically followed the rule. When my grandmother called during lunch, I would listen to her speak Spanish but reply only with yes, no, or a quiet sound of agreement, hoping anyone nearby would assume I was speaking to an English-speaking relative. After she had a minor fall during passing period, I hid in a bathroom stall and answered her questions without using a single Spanish word. We had even developed a tapping code. 3 taps meant she should take her medicine, and 4 meant she should call my mother. It took nearly 15 minutes to confirm that she was safe, and I arrived late to chemistry, but at least I had not been suspended. My grandmother understood the rule as well as she could, and tried to call only when something truly mattered. Sometimes, however, she became confused or forgot that I was still at school. To reduce the risk, our neighbor agreed to text me first whenever there was a real emergency. If I received that warning, I would walk beyond the edge of school property before calling back in Spanish. The system was awkward, but it worked for a while, and I convinced myself I could keep managing everything until graduation. Emergencies, however, do not respect carefully designed systems. One afternoon during history class, my phone began vibrating in my pocket. I ignored it at first because checking it could get me in trouble. Then it vibrated again and again, until the number of missed calls became impossible to dismiss. Our neighbor had never called more than twice before. By the time the count reached 12, my hands were already shaking. When it climbed toward 25, I knew something had gone badly wrong. The moment my teacher turned to write on the board, I slipped into the hallway and called back. Our neighbor answered in a panic, speaking so quickly in Spanish that I could barely separate one sentence from the next. My grandmother had collapsed and was barely breathing. Paramedics were already in the house, but our neighbor could not translate the name of my grandmother's heart medication. The problem was not minor. One medication had a long name that sounded similar to another drug my grandmother was dangerously allergic to, and in her fear, our neighbor kept mixing them up. I tried using our tapping system, but she was crying too hard to understand. I texted the medication name, but she was trying to hold the phone, answer the paramedics, and stay beside my grandmother at the same time. There was no practical way for her to read the message aloud accurately. At that moment, the choice became brutally simple. I could protect my school record, or I could give the people treating my grandmother the information that might keep her alive. I started running toward the main exit while speaking rapid Spanish into the phone. I told our neighbor exactly where the medicine was stored. In the bathroom cabinet, on the third shelf, behind the vitamins, inside the white bottle rather than the blue one. She put me on speaker so I could communicate with the paramedics. They did not speak Spanish, which forced me to translate back and forth while I ran. Medical terms came to me in whichever language I had learned them first, so I switched between Spanish and English too quickly to keep track. I explained the heart medication, corrected the similar drug name, and warned them about my grandmother's severe penicillin allergy. Then I shifted back into Spanish to calm our neighbor, who kept asking whether my grandmother was going to die. I was so focused on giving accurate information that I did not notice Principal Caldwell standing near the main entrance. He had taken out his personal phone and was recording me. His expression revealed nothing. He did not ask whether someone was hurt, whether I needed help, or why I was running through the hallway in tears. He simply watched me speak the forbidden language and preserved the evidence. I reached my car and stayed focused on the call until the paramedics had the information they needed. I spent the rest of the afternoon terrified that I had already been too late. Fortunately, my grandmother survived. The doctor later told us that the allergy information I had translated prevented a potentially fatal medication error. If the paramedics had administered the wrong drug, she might have died within minutes. Hearing that should have made the decision feel simple. I had broken a school rule, but I had helped save my grandmother's life. I assumed even Principal Caldwell would understand the difference once he knew what had happened. The next morning, I entered first period and found him sitting at my teacher's desk with his laptop open. The entire class was silent. He turned the screen toward me, played hallway footage with clear audio of me speaking Spanish, and placed a suspension form on the desk. My name had already been filled in. "Would you like to explain why you believed you were exempt from our English-only policy?" he asked. It was not a sincere question. He had chosen the classroom because he wanted the other students to watch. The recording played on a loop, showing me running through the hall with my phone pressed to my ear. My mouth went dry, and my legs felt so heavy that I could barely move. I forced myself to explain that my grandmother had been dying, and that the paramedics needed to know which medication could trigger a fatal reaction. Before I could finish, Principal Caldwell raised one hand and stopped me. "Emergencies do not override school policy," he said calmly. "You could have found another way." His tone made the statement sound reasonable, but there had been no other way, and he knew it. The suspension form between us felt less like paperwork than a verdict prepared before I entered the room. I asked whether I could call my mother. He told me she would have to speak English during school hours or bring an approved interpreter. Then he opened a drawer, removed a thick packet covered in yellow highlights, and pushed it toward me. My disciplinary hearing was scheduled for Thursday at 10 in the morning. I had the right to bring a parent or guardian, but the entire proceeding would be conducted in English. When the bell rang, everyone grabbed their bags and hurried out without meeting my eyes. Principal Caldwell packed up his laptop and left me standing alone with the packet in my hands. By the time I reached the hallway, whispers had already begun. Some students stared at their phones while looking in my direction. Others made jokes about Spanish jail loudly enough for me to hear. My face burned, but I kept walking. Before I reached my next class, the office secretary appeared and told me to follow her. She led me to the administrative office, pointed to a hard plastic chair near the window, and informed me that I was excused from classes for the day but required to remain there until dismissal. I tried to text our neighbor for an update on my grandmother. My fingers kept slipping across the screen because I was still shaking. The secretary gave me a form and instructed me to write an official statement. The blank lines seemed almost hostile. Every attempt to describe a life-or-death emergency in formal English sounded weak or incomplete. I crossed out sentence after sentence because each grammar mistake made me worry that the school would treat me as less credible. The secretary watched me struggle without offering help. After my fifth attempt, I asked for a copy of the hallway recording so I could review the evidence being used against me. She did not look away from her computer. "That is internal evidence," she said. "Students are not permitted to access it." The answer made my stomach drop. The school had a recording of my private emergency call, but I was not allowed to examine or respond to it properly. Another student waiting across from me leaned closer and quietly mentioned that the hallway security cameras captured audio. Until then, I had not even known that conversations were being recorded. I pulled out a notebook and began writing down every time, location, and detail I could remember. I tried to identify anyone who might have seen me running or heard the fear in my voice. I needed witnesses who could confirm that this had not been a planned protest, because rumors were already spreading that I had deliberately broken the rule to make a political statement. Messages from classmates arrived faster than I could answer them. Some asked whether I was trying to become a hero. Others accused me of wanting attention. The story had been twisted before I had even completed my statement. I turned off my notifications and shoved the phone into my backpack. Students passing the office window pointed and stared at me as if I were part of a display. The form remained mostly blank, because no carefully written paragraph could capture what had actually happened. I could not find a polite way to explain that my grandmother's life mattered more than a policy designed to punish our language. Then our neighbor texted that my grandmother was stable but very weak. She kept asking for me in Spanish. Relief hit so suddenly that I had to grip the edge of the desk, but it was followed immediately by guilt. I should have been at home with her instead of sitting under fluorescent lights in the school office. I pushed the unsigned form back toward the secretary and walked out while she called after me that I did not have permission to leave. The hallway was empty during class, and my footsteps echoed as I went to my locker. A note had been taped to the door. The guidance office had scheduled me for an appointment the following morning with Daniel Mercer, a counselor who supposedly assisted bilingual students facing disciplinary problems. I had no reason to trust that anyone in the building would help me, but I kept the appointment card. That evening, my mother and I sat at the kitchen table, trying to eat when the official hearing email arrived. It listed a 3-day suspension, a permanent record notation, and a review of my enrollment status. Those final words turned my mother's face white. The school was not merely threatening to remove me from class for 3 days. They were suggesting they could expel or transfer me during my final year. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand while we read the message again. Searching for language that might make it less serious, there was none. The next morning I arrived early for my meeting with Daniel Mercer. He was a quiet man with glasses who listened instead of interrupting. For the first time since the emergency, I was able to explain the entire sequence without someone treating the policy as more important than the facts. Daniel told me the school had broad disciplinary authority, but he also pointed out that district non-discrimination policies might conflict with a rule that punished students for using their native language. He did not promise that I would win. Instead, he gave me a practical list of what to document, what evidence to request, and how to present the emergency at the hearing. His honesty made his office feel safer than any other room in the school had felt in 2 years. During lunch, I walked beyond the parking lot and called the hospital. I asked whether the emergency room doctor and paramedics could provide written statements explaining how my translation had prevented the medication error. The hospital administrator said she would try, but warned that obtaining official letterhead and the necessary signatures could take several days. I wrote down her name and direct number so I could follow up. By the time I returned to school, someone had posted about my case on social media. Half the comments insisted that rules were rules. The other half argued that saving a life mattered more than any language policy. I did not want to become a symbol in someone else's online argument, so I deleted the apps from my phone. After chemistry, my teacher asked me to stay behind. Once the room was empty, she admitted that the language policy had always felt wrong to her, but teachers feared losing their jobs if they challenged it. She opened the student handbook and showed me the district's own non-discrimination language, which appeared to contradict the English-only rule. Her hands shook slightly as she pointed to the section online and told me to print copies before it changed. That evening, my mother contacted a local legal aid group, and an advocate named Adrian Cole called us. He explained that federal civil rights protections could apply to discrimination against language minorities, but schools often defended broad restrictions by claiming safety concerns. A formal federal complaint could take months, possibly longer than the time remaining before graduation. The system, he warned, moved much more slowly than the consequences in a student's life. The following morning, I went to the main office and formally requested a Spanish interpreter for the hearing because my mother struggled with legal and disciplinary language in English. The secretary told me interpreters were provided only for special education meetings, not student discipline. I wrote down her exact words, along with the date and time. Assistant Principal Thomas Blake later pulled me aside and suggested that I accept Saturday detention instead of challenging the school. He looked exhausted, as if he had watched other students face the same choice and already knew how their cases usually ended. For a moment, the easy path tempted me. Then I remembered my grandmother on the floor while the paramedics tried to identify the drug that could harm her. I thanked him and refused. The rest of the week moved slowly. Teachers watched me differently, and students whispered whenever I entered a room. A few tried speaking Spanish to me as a joke, hoping I would answer and create another violation. I kept my mouth shut. My grandmother called twice, but I let both calls go to voicemail because I could not risk anyone hearing me speak to her on school property again. My mother took unpaid time away from the warehouse to help me prepare. We printed the handbook, organized emails, and practiced my statement in English late into the night. There was something deeply wrong about having to explain, in English, why speaking Spanish had saved a life. On the morning of the original hearing date, an email arrived from the scholarship committee reviewing my application. They were preparing to examine all disciplinary records before making final decisions the following week. 4 years of straight-A grades and perfect attendance could be overshadowed by a suspension for helping my grandmother. The hearing had been moved to 2 in the afternoon, which meant I still had to sit through most of the school day, knowing that my college plans might depend on what happened in a conference room. At lunch, my mother texted that my grandmother had been released from the hospital. She now needed constant supervision and medication checks every 4 hours. I spent the rest of the period setting alarms and coordinating with our neighbor. I also had a chemistry test the next day and had barely studied. Every responsibility in my life seemed to be colliding at once. During study hall, Adrian emailed that he had researched the school's audio recordings. Depending on the circumstances, recording hallway conversations might raise concerns under state privacy law, but courts often gave schools wide authority when administrators claimed safety reasons. Every argument we found seemed to have a counter-argument that protected the institution. Then a classmate I barely knew sent me a shaky phone video. It showed Principal Caldwell standing by the entrance, with his personal phone aimed directly at me during the emergency call. This was not merely a security camera capturing an incident by accident. He had chosen to record me himself while I was visibly distressed. I forwarded the video to Daniel immediately and saved copies in more than one place. That night, Daniel came to our house and helped me build a timeline from the emergency onward. Each time I wrote about how humiliated or frightened I had felt, he gently crossed it out and asked me to replace emotion with something verifiable. The time of the missed calls, the location of the camera, the exact words used by the secretary, the name of the hospital administrator, and the moment Principal Caldwell raised his phone. At first, stripping away the emotion felt unfair, because the emotion was part of what the school had done to me. Still, the exercise calmed me. Facts were harder to dismiss than feelings, especially when every fact led to another document or witness. Over the next day, I quietly approached Vietnamese and Haitian students about their experiences with the rule. Most were too frightened to attach their names to anything, but several agreed to write anonymous statements. One girl had lost her place in the National Honor Society after answering a call from her mother in Vietnamese. A Haitian student told me his parents had stopped attending his games because they were afraid they might accidentally speak French near a staff member. Another family described missing important news from relatives because their child would not answer calls during school hours. The individual stories were different, but the pattern was the same: fear, punishment, and families withdrawing from school life. After classes, I collected more statements and began to understand that my case was only the most visible example of a much larger problem. That evening, I used the language Daniel and Adrian had explained to write a formal grievance to the district. I cited discrimination, the refusal to provide interpreter services, and the school's use of the emergency recording. I attached the handbook section, the written accounts from other families, the video showing Principal Caldwell's personal recording, and my timeline. My hands shook when I pressed send. Until that moment, I had still been a student asking the school to reconsider. Now I had created a record outside the building and challenged the policy itself. The following morning, Principal Caldwell seemed to appear everywhere I went. He stood near my locker when I arrived, crossed the cafeteria just as I sat down, and remained close to the bathroom entrance during the period when I usually went. I could not prove what he intended, so I followed Daniel's advice and documented only what happened. Each time I saw him, I texted Daniel the time and location. The constant attention made the building feel smaller. During lunch, my mother called to say her supervisor had warned that any more missed shifts for school meetings could result in reduced hours. We needed her income to pay for my grandmother's new prescriptions. I told her she should not sacrifice more work for me, but she refused. She said she would not let me face the school alone, regardless of what it cost. Before chemistry that afternoon, my chest tightened so suddenly that I could not draw a full breath. The room tilted, and I grabbed a desk to keep from falling. The nurse identified it as a panic attack and asked whether I wanted to call someone who could help calm me. I wanted my grandmother's voice, but even in the nurse's office, I was afraid to speak Spanish. The rule had done more than make me careful. It had taught me to fear the language that had comforted me since childhood. I sat there shaking, aware that the school had made my own voice feel dangerous. That evening, Adrian spent nearly an hour on the phone with my mother and me. He prepared a formal notice for the district's legal counsel regarding possible civil rights violations and read each section aloud in ordinary language before asking us to sign. He never claimed that a complaint would guarantee a victory. Instead, he explained the risks, the delays, and the possibility that publicity could make administrators more defensive. Every option carried consequences. Staying quiet would protect my record in the short term but leave the policy untouched. Continuing could threaten my scholarship, my mother's income, and my remaining months at school. The district replied to my interpreter request the next morning with 3 carefully written paragraphs that promised almost nothing. Officials said they would review the matter, but they would not provide an interpreter for the hearing. I printed the email and highlighted every phrase that avoided a definite commitment. The response felt designed to exhaust families until they stopped asking. I spent the afternoon recording my statement repeatedly on my phone. The medical terminology kept coming to me in Spanish, because that was the language I used when helping my grandmother sort her prescriptions. I had to force myself to say cardiac medication instead of the Spanish phrase that arrived first. My tongue felt heavy, as if even my mouth understood how unnatural the requirement was. On the morning before the hearing, the hospital finally sent an attachment. The emergency physician had written a brief letter on official letterhead confirming that my translation had prevented a potentially fatal medication error. His signature at the bottom changed the case from my word against the principal's interpretation into a documented medical emergency. I printed several copies and placed the original in a folder. For the first time, I felt as though I had something strong enough to stand between me and the suspension form. At lunch, a trusted classmate helped me review the anonymous statements. We practiced reading them in steady voices, without identifying the families. One parent wrote that her child had been suspended for answering a phone call in Vietnamese. Another described being unable to coordinate childcare during an emergency because her daughter was afraid to speak their family's language at school. A family had missed a funeral after communication broke down. One younger student had been too frightened to ask for the bathroom in Vietnamese after forgetting the English word and had wet himself. These were not abstract complaints about cultural pride. The policy had created practical harm, embarrassment, and lost opportunities. Daniel recommended copying the district equity officer on every hearing document so the record would exist beyond the principal's office. I scanned every email, statement, policy page, medical letter, and screenshot, then organized the copies with the rest of my hearing materials. The evidence no longer depended entirely on the school allowing me access to its internal system. Each page showed that what happened to me was connected to a wider pattern. That evening, Assistant Principal Blake came to our house with what he described as a final offer. If I signed an agreement promising not to discuss the language policy publicly, the school would replace the suspension with detention and remove the disciplinary notation. He placed the paper on our kitchen table and explained how easily the entire problem could disappear. For a moment, I stared at the signature line. I was tired, my mother was losing wages, my grandmother needed care, and my scholarship was uncertain. Signing would protect me. It would also require me to stay silent while other students continued living under the same threat. I slid the paper back and declined. Blake folded it into his briefcase with a look that seemed more disappointed than angry. Soon afterward, messages arrived from students who wanted to organize a walkout on the day of the hearing. Their support moved me, but I knew the school could suspend them or damage their scholarships. I sent reply after reply asking them not to risk their futures for my case. I wanted witnesses and statements, not more students trapped in the same disciplinary system. That night, my grandmother sat with me at the kitchen table. She did not understand every legal issue, but she understood that I was frightened. In Spanish, she told me to speak the truth, even if it cost me something, because truth mattered more than a rule built on fear. I translated her words onto an index card to carry into the hearing. The following morning, I stood in the same bathroom where I had once hidden inside a stall and communicated with her through taps. I looked at myself in the scratched mirror and decided that I was finished apologizing for being bilingual. At the hearing, I would speak in English, because that was the only language the school allowed. But I would explain clearly that both languages were part of how I thought, cared for my family, and understood the world. Taking one away did not make me more successful. It made me less able to respond when someone I loved needed me. The day of the hearing arrived before I felt ready. My alarm rang at 6:30. I texted Daniel to confirm he was coming, and he replied with a thumbs up. My hands shook while I made coffee and tried to eat toast that tasted like cardboard. The evidence folder sat on the table beside the hospital letter and the anonymous family statements. My mother came out wearing the clothes she normally saved for parent-teacher conferences. Neither of us had an appetite, but she cooked eggs because doing something ordinary gave us a way to move through the morning. Daniel arrived at 7:45 in a button-down shirt. We reviewed the order of my statement, the documents we would submit, and the people expected to attend. Assistant Principal Blake would serve as the school's student advocate, and a district representative had been added after my grievance. Daniel practiced the medical terms with me and agreed to help my mother when formal English became difficult. While we were reviewing the folder, Our neighbor called to ask whether my grandmother's morning medication should be taken with food. From home, without anyone monitoring my language, I explained calmly that the white pills went with breakfast and the pink pill was for bedtime. After I ended the call, Daniel pointed out how naturally I spoke when I was not afraid of punishment. My mother placed her hand on my shoulder, and we gathered the documents. I brought 2 copies of everything because I did not want the school to keep my only originals. The walk from home to the building felt longer than usual. Students watched us pass, but I kept my eyes forward. The secretary looked surprised when she saw my mother and Daniel together, then directed us toward the conference room. The door was open. Principal Caldwell sat at the head of a long table with his laptop and several folders. Assistant Principal Blake sat on his left with a yellow legal pad. Across from him was a woman wearing a district identification badge. My sophomore English teacher was present as the faculty representative and gave me a small, encouraging nod. There was no interpreter. My written request, the grievance, and the district's promise to review the issue had changed nothing for that meeting. Daniel sat behind me, and my mother took the chair to my right. Principal Caldwell kept his attention on his laptop for nearly a minute after we entered. When he finally looked up, his face was neutral, as if the meeting concerned attendance data rather than my future. He turned the laptop toward us and played the hallway footage. The recording showed me running while speaking into my phone, switching between Spanish and English as I tried to relay the medication information. The audio was clear enough to capture nearly every word. He allowed the video to run for several minutes before stopping it and placing a suspension form on the table. He stated that the evidence demonstrated willful defiance of the school's English-only policy. I kept my hands flat against my thighs so no one could see them shaking. I confirmed that I had spoken Spanish and explained why. I described the missed calls, my grandmother's collapse, the similar medication names, our neighbor's confusion, and the need to warn the paramedics about the allergy. Then I removed the hospital letter and slid a copy toward the district representative. She read it carefully. Principal Caldwell said the medical outcome did not change the fact that I had violated a clearly stated rule. In his view, exceptions would weaken the entire policy. The district representative asked to retain a copy of the letter and began taking notes on a tablet. I handed her the anonymous family statements. As she read, her eyebrows rose. The statements showed that the rule had damaged more than conversations. Students had lost academic honors, families had stopped attending events, urgent calls had gone unanswered, and children had been humiliated because they were afraid to use the only words available to them. I also explained that medical knowledge did not always exist in my mind in one language. I had learned many of my grandmother's prescription terms in Spanish, so forcing me to translate every concept before speaking could slow down information during an emergency. A rule supposedly created for safety had made safe communication more difficult. Assistant Principal Blake asked whether I had additional documentation. I provided the state education guidance Daniel had found, the district non-discrimination policy, my interpreter request, the secretary's response, and the video showing Principal Caldwell deliberately recording me on his personal phone. The district representative watched that clip twice. Principal Caldwell said nothing, but his jaw tightened. When my mother began speaking, her English became choppy under the pressure. She explained that she worked at a warehouse, that my grandmother lived with us, and that I was the person most able to respond during the school day. When she could not find a word, Daniel quietly supplied it to me, and I repeated it so the record would be clear. My mother described avoiding school events after staff mocked her accent. Her voice cracked when she said she was proud that I had helped save my grandmother. Even though the school intended to punish me for it, the district representative typed more quickly as she listened. Assistant Principal Blake suggested a compromise. If I withdrew the district grievance, the school would reduce the 3-day suspension to 1 day. I told him respectfully that I was asking for the policy to be reviewed, not simply for a better private deal. Principal Caldwell accused me of being deliberately difficult and reminded me that actions had consequences. Before I could respond, the district representative said any final discipline should be delayed until the district examined the language access issues raised by the grievance. Principal Caldwell objected that ordinary school discipline did not require district approval. She replied that a civil rights complaint and a denied interpreter request were not ordinary discipline. They continued for more than an hour, using careful professional language while my scholarship and school record remained unresolved. Eventually, the district representative proposed an interim decision. I would receive 1 day of in-school suspension rather than 3 days out of school. My permanent record would be marked as under review instead of carrying an immediate final violation, and the district would examine emergency language exceptions and interpreter access. It was not a complete victory. I was still being punished for the call, and Principal Caldwell still refused to admit the policy had caused harm. but the original suspension and enrollment review were no longer automatic. I signed the form because the decision was the only one available that day. The next morning, I reported to a small room near the main office, where suspended students completed worksheets at desks facing the wall. There were no windows. While I sat there, my chemistry class conducted a titration lab worth 10% of the course grade. The teacher had already announced that there would be no makeup labs. Missing it lowered my grade from an A to a B. The school had reduced the number of suspension days, but the punishment still carried a real academic cost. I ate lunch alone in the same room while the monitor watched from her desk. Students passing the narrow window looked inside. Some nodded in support. Others whispered, pointed, or mouthed that I had gotten off easily. One student shook her head as if I had created too much trouble over nothing. Sitting there with a soggy sandwich, I understood that challenging the policy had changed how people saw me. Even students who agreed with me did not always want to stand close enough to share the consequences. That evening, I went directly to my grandmother's room. She was sitting in her chair watching a Spanish-language soap opera. When she asked about school, I told her it had been fine and sat on the floor beside her. I did not explain the suspension or the chemistry grade. She had survived a medical crisis and did not need to carry the knowledge that helping save her had cost me at school. We watched television in silence while she ran her fingers through my hair the way she had when I was younger. For once, the absence of words felt peaceful rather than forced. 3 days later, my mother forwarded an email the district had sent to staff. It announced a limited inquiry into language access practices across its schools. The hallways felt different after that message. Conversations stopped when I approached. Teachers who had once joked with me became strictly formal, as if any casual interaction might become part of another complaint. Being right about the harm did not make me welcome. 2 weeks after the hearing, the district issued a new memo. It created an emergency exception, allowing students to use another language during documented medical or safety situations. It also required schools to honor interpreter requests for parent meetings. Principal Caldwell called an assembly and read the new rules as narrowly as possible. He emphasized that ordinary communication still had to be in English, and that the exception applied only to verified emergencies. He never acknowledged my grandmother or admitted that the previous policy had been dangerous. Even so, the change mattered. Another student facing an emergency would no longer have to choose between speaking and protecting a school record. The scholarship committee did not immediately clear me. It sent a letter saying the decision would be deferred until the district completed its review of my disciplinary status. That left me unable to make firm college plans. Each week, I submitted careful updates about my grades, attendance, and activities. I did not pretend the suspension had never happened, but I focused on the record I had built over 4 years, and the fact that the disciplinary finding remained under review. Waiting became another form of punishment. I could not budget, accept housing, or know whether college was financially possible. While the district process continued, I wrote an opinion piece for the school newspaper about what it felt like to move through the building with only half a voice. I did not name Principal Caldwell, mention my suspension, or identify any family. I described the mental effort of translating thoughts before speaking, the fear of answering a parent's call, and the way familiar words could become trapped in your throat. Publishing it felt safer than speaking in the hallway because the ideas existed on paper, where they could not be punished as an accidental utterance. After the article appeared, students began approaching me quietly. A Vietnamese classmate showed me the sentences he had highlighted because they matched his experience. A Haitian girl from band said she had sent the piece to her parents. Other students simply told me they had believed they were the only ones who felt divided between the language of school and the language of home. Their reactions confirmed that the grievance had never been only about my emergency call. As the school year moved toward its final week, the district's broader review was still open, and the scholarship process remained tied to the unresolved status of my record. The uncertainty never fully disappeared during that school year. I also could not recover the chemistry lab or the grade I lost. The new emergency exception did not erase the panic attack, the humiliation in front of my class, my mother's missed wages, or the weeks when I was afraid to answer my grandmother's calls. Policy changes can prevent future harm without repairing everything already done. During the final week of school, I passed Principal Caldwell in the hallway on my way to history. We did not greet each other. He looked directly at me, and this time I did not lower my eyes. I was still careful about what I said inside that building, because the ordinary English-only rule remained in place. But I was no longer willing to be silent about what the rule did to students and families. I had learned that institutions often call obedience safety until someone forces them to examine who is being harmed. My grandmother survived because I used every word available to me when it mattered. The school punished me for that choice, then changed its policy because the evidence made the old one impossible to defend completely. I did not walk away with a perfect victory. I lost a lab grade, spent a day in suspension, strained relationships with teachers, and waded through months of uncertainty about college. What I gained was the certainty that speaking Spanish had never made me less capable or less deserving. It had allowed me to protect someone I loved. By graduation, I understood that my two languages were not competing halves of my identity. Together, they were my whole voice, and I was finished letting anyone teach me to be ashamed of it.